Alrighty, so we just went over some loach facts in the wild. Now it's time to talk a bit more about loaches in captivity, the aquaria side of loaches. What we're going to do here, we're going to go over some general caretaking information for them and stuff like that, and then look at some of the more common and frequent species that people add to their tanks and go into a little bit more depth in how to take care of them. So to start things off, kind of good idea to talk about what kinds of tanks are good for loaches. Well, as you can see on the picture here, wide is pretty good. As loaches are bottom feeders, height in a tank doesn't do as much as width, that sort of surface area down on the ground. Sand usually makes for the best base. They like to, go along the sand, slither into it, and lots of little places to hide are very good as well. These are especially important if you're having some of the more longer, noodlier types of loach that I'll talk about a little bit later. But a soft substrate is super, super good. Logs, sturdy plants to hide in. However, there is something pretty important to note here. Loaches can get pretty big, and they're most often schooling fish. So you want to make sure you have as much space as needed for the amount of loaches you're going to have. And make sure you do a lot of research on each individual species you're thinking of keeping as well. Loaches themselves are often extremely peaceful. They don't really butt heads with other fish as much. They butt heads a little bit with each other. That's just sort of to create a pecking order across them. But in other species, not much at all. So if you have an established tank and you determine that you do have enough space and enough room for all this new life to come in, they don't really have to worry too much about the loaches bothering any other fish. They can sometimes, though, have troubles with snails in the tanks if you have snails. As loaches are bottom feeders, you need to make sure that the food that you give them actually sinks down into the water. And since they are omnivorous, it's important that when you give them feed that contains both plant and animal matter to keep them healthy. It doesn't always have to be all at once, but making sure that they get a varied amount of both is very important to their health. Would also like to bring up that because they're bottom feeders, some people think they can get away with not feeding them at all, that they'll just eat all the scraps that the fish don't leave behind. That is wrong. You do need to feed them. You need to make sure that they are getting as much nutrients as they can. Otherwise, they will start getting sick and dying. They'll just starve. They cannot survive alone off the algae and plant waste that your other fish drop. So you have to feed them specifically and make sure you're cleaning up food waste as well to keep the tank clean. All right, now we're going to start talking about the specific care of some specific loaches. You've been seeing them a lot in the background, some of the pictures I've been showing you. These are the clown loaches. They're some of the most popular loaches to keep in your tank, which is a little bit surprising because clown roaches have some interesting properties to them that make them a little bit difficult. Most notably, they are growers. They are slow growers, but they are still growers. Well, they start out fairly small, like you're seeing here. They can grow up to about a foot long. These ones are even a little bit smaller than they can get to. That size issue is really exacerbated by the fact that they, like most loaches, are schooling fish. Prefer to be in much larger group than many people keep them in. The more loaches you have in a tank, the more happy and excited they'll be to move around. If you only have like 1 or 2 to 3, they're just going to stay hidden most of the time. You have like 6, they'll come out sometimes. But if you have like 30, which is what they often want, they'll be out all the time. However, keeping 30 fish that can grow to this size can be a monumental task. It can be very difficult to sell and get rid of fish when they reach that size. So it's very, very important that you know what you're going to do with your loaches once they reach that size and if you can contain them. They prefer a warmer tank on average, and they're a bit more social than some of the other loaches, preferring those larger sizes than some of the others. Boop, boop. However, if you have fallen in love with these clownfish, but there's no way you can make the size of that many fish getting that big, you have a few options. You can use ditherfish. Ditherfish, they're kind of a classification of fish in aquarium management. Basically, any non-threatening schooling fish that can make it more of a safe environment for other schooling fish to come out, like clownfish when they're not large in numbers. So if you can only have a handful of clownfish, you can keep them there with ditherfish, and the ditherfish will help them feel safe and comfortable in a school, even though it's not necessarily a school of their own. But let's say even just them growing to that size at all is just too much for you to worry about. If you're still wanting loaches in your tanks, well, don't worry, because here's the coolie loach, another very common type of loach to keep. Unlike the clown loaches, these guys only grow to about a couple inches in length and have a much lower bioload. They do still like to hang out in a school. However, they can hang out in a bit smaller numbers than the clownfish. You want at least 6, but more is always appreciated. Just however many you can have depends on nitrate levels, how much space you have, bacteria, yada yada, the stuff you've been learning in class. As these guys are longer and more noodly, having sand for most loaches is a recommendation, but that's kind of more closer to a requirement for these guys. They really enjoy burrowing down, sliding along the sand, and having places to really swim through, quite like that. So logs, even PVC pipe that they can swim through, strong enough plants. While they won't really eat or tear up the plants very much, their slithering can knock them loose, so they need to be a bit sturdier so they can handle that slithering. However, these guys are a little bit more sensitive to elevated parameters in terms of ammonia, nitrates, all that stuff. And they're quite a bit more fragile than not only a lot of other loaches, but a lot of other fish as a whole. So if you begin to have troubles with your levels in your fish tank, these guys can start getting stressed and sick much quicker and easier than other fish, making them a little bit not quite a newbie's first fish, let's just say. All right, you guys are getting a variety of loaches here today. This is the reticulated hillstream loach. Looking quite a bit different than the other guys. These are flat, so they can stick to rocks and would stand high-paced, fast streams, given their hillstream name. Because that is their more natural environment, they do prefer a cooler temperature. Usually around the 65 degrees Fahrenheit range. 65 to 80 degrees is comfortable, but you really do want to edge towards cooler, because the hotter it is, just the more susceptible to stress and illness that they'll be. It used to be believed that these guys could only really be kept in specific tanks designed to replicate streams. However, that's not necessarily true. They get along pretty well in most types of tanks. The important part is really keeping the pH level nice and stable at a good 7 to 7.8 range. They're very sensitive to that. If that gets too out of line, they can start getting sick and getting very, very stressed. But as long as that pH is kept very well and the temperature is kept cool, they seem to do really well in a more captive environment, regardless of the fish around them. And of course, these guys too are schooling fish. However, they're kind of the more solitary of the ones that we've seen today. At least 3 is kind of the range you want to be. Actually, even 1 is arguably fine. They seem to do all right with that. Just 3 is kind of considered better. However, you do not want to just have 2. Just having 2 of these guys, they can get kind of aggressive with each other, and the stronger is likely to end up bullying the weaker of the 2. So you want to have, at the very minimum 1 3 add on, the more is not going to hurt or anything like that, as long as your tank can support it. Well, they're not typically aggressive to other fish. If a tank is too open and doesn't have very many places to hide, males will often fight for dominance within each other. For the most part, though, as long as you keep things clean, give them enough of the spaces that they want, it will not be an issue. And now for just a couple questions. True or false? Because loaches are bottom feeders, they can eat algae and whatever scraps are left over from other fish and don't need to be specifically fed. True or false? If there isn't enough space in the tank to handle a full school of loaches, you can include dither fish into your tank to help make the smaller groups of loaches more comfortable and active. Oh, and we got one more question here. I had to include one non-true or false question, though, frankly, it's not much different. How many loaches are ideal for a tank? Pick one. 1 loach. 6 loaches. 12 loaches. 30 loaches. Or, depends on the type of loach, the size of the tank, and total bio load. Like I said, not too much different. Hope you guys have a great semester, and I'll see you in class.